So I've been training to heart rate seriously for about 3.5 years now. Before that, I occasionally glanced at heart rate. It was a bit of a novelty, but I never really paid that much attention to it. I tended to train more by pace or perceived effort. That's me doing finger quotes there. I'm doing that because I think perceived effort is potentially one of the most overrated or misused concepts in running. I tend to think if you don't have clear reference points for particular efforts outside of your own mind, which is easily diluted or manipulated by you, then you end up getting away from the actual physiological intensities that you should be running at. For example, I can definitely say that marathon pace feels easy sometimes. If I'm in the first 5 or 10k of a marathon, that pace feels very easy. But it's definitely not the pace I should be doing my easy runs. And when training at threshold, it's really easy to do a kind of slow boil, where over the course of weeks and months, you might gradually increase the intensity of what you deem threshold without realizing it. Obviously, your incentive is to go faster and faster because that signifies fitness gains. But if you've simply pushed harder and harder beyond threshold, well then you've simply fooled yourself into thinking you've gotten fitter, when in fact you've likely gotten slower because you've not actually been training at threshold and pushed your anaerobic threshold up from below. If you used an internal metric like heart rate though, you'd be able to see this intensity increase and you'd be in a better position to be able to keep it constant over time. So we need physiological parameters to actually define what each intensity is if we want to be really precise, or at least more precise than simply just going off feels. Now, heart rate isn't perfect. Obviously, your heart rate zones fluctuate with fitness. People always point to things like, if you're stressed or tired, fatigued, you've had some caffeine, or maybe you've had a hard day at work, then your heart rate can be elevated. And I would say, yeah, that's true, but if that's the case, I want to know about it. That's a feature of heart rate training. It lets you know these things. It's not a flaw. Telling you to slow down a little bit because you're stressed or tired, that's a good thing. I want to have that information. You shouldn't just ignore it because you don't like what it's telling you. But I can see that lactate is probably a better proxy for metabolic stress than heart rate. But lactate monitors are expensive, really inconvenient, and there's just something about drawing blood all the time that really turns me off. Don't like that idea. So purely based on accessibility and convenience, heart rate is good enough. Now, that's all well and good, but people often struggle with where do they start. The prescriptions for heart rate zones, as well as how to find your max heart rate, well, they're really, really unreliable. They might be all well and good for a population average, but for each individual, they're not very useful. For example, you might have a 30-year-old with a max heart rate of 170 and then another one with a max heart rate of 210. Well, the average is 190. But if I'm the person with 170 max heart rate, basing my heart rate zones on 190 max heart rate isn't going to do me much good. And the same goes for the person with a max heart rate of 210. So what to do instead? Well, what I did was I started collecting a pool of data from training, from racing, and the thing that I was concerned with the most at first was my anaerobic threshold. I wanted to know where that was in terms of heart rate because I was starting to do more and more threshold training, and simply going off pace or perceived effort, it didn't offer the precision that I was after. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't exceeding threshold. So what did I do? Well, lots of people would go and get a lab test, but living down here in Hobart, Tasmania, I wasn't aware of anyone who offered that service at the time. So again, I looked at my race results, I looked at half marathons in particular, and I just looked to see the trends in terms of my heart rate pattern, heart rate curve, and I found that in the races that didn't go particularly well, my heart rate exceeded a particular figure fairly early on in the race, and therefore I estimated that this was me crossing that anaerobic threshold. I'll go into more detail here and give a few examples. So this is an instance of a half marathon that went well. It's the Gold Coast Half Marathon from 2024. I've drawn a line at 163 BPM, which is the estimate I've been using for LT2, and you can see that while below it, I'm definitely in a steady state. My pace is consistent at around 3:45 a kilometre here, and then at halfway, I make a concerted push for home, and I break out of this steady state and average 3:39 a kilometre to the finish. Now, I was probably a touch conservative in this race, but this tale of two halves definitely highlights a changing of physiological state. Somewhere in the low to mid 160 heart rate range, I've crossed from a steady threshold state into a more VO2 max zone, where I'm working really hard as I drive for home. Here's another instance of a race that went well. You can see that I was even more conservative in the early stages here, and I was able to finish with an even bigger negative split. One more example of a race that went well, the Ross Half Marathon of 2021. Again, I finished with a big negative split. You can see that I'm well below this 163 BPM figure in the early stages. And here we are, an example of a half marathon that didn't go well. This is the Sunshine Coast Half Marathon from 2023. I started the race at about the right effort, but because the pace was slower than I wanted it to be, I panicked coming off the second hill and pushed far too hard from too early in the race. You can see that at around 7 kilometres in, I breached this 163 BPM figure, and within 2 kilometres, my heart rate is up above 170 BPM. I slowed a touch just after 10 kilometres, but significantly fell apart just after 15 kilometres into the race, and I bled a heap of time. I ran 120 when I was hoping to run something around 117. Here's another example of a half marathon that went poorly. You can see that I breached this 163 BPM figure about 5 kilometres in. I progressively slowed from this point on. So while it may look like my heart rate remains steady, that's only because my intensity output continually dropped throughout the race. I ended up running about 5 minutes slower than I was aiming for. Now, this 163 BPM figure may not be exact, but it's proven to be good enough. It's likely that it's a little conservative, especially when I consider my most recent half marathon. You can see that I've crossed 163 BPM at around 1 kilometre in, and I'm consistently over it from the 5 kilometre mark. I ran really well here, and I had plenty left in the tank from the 15k mark on. We have to consider, however, that as I've gotten faster and fitter, the nature of the event has changed. It's much shorter in duration, and I found that from doing so much threshold or sub-threshold training, I'm able to ride that line a lot more effectively. But in any case, it's likely that I've underestimated my anaerobic threshold, but that doesn't seem to matter, and it's likely a lot better than overestimating. By lowballing the figure, I'm still training within the threshold zone or at a threshold intensity, and therefore I'm pushing my anaerobic threshold up from below. I then did a similar thing for my marathon results to estimate my aerobic threshold, and that would be LT1. Though my estimate of LT1 is probably not quite as precise as LT2, it served a purpose in helping to control my intensity in efforts such as longer, more intense runs, or even doing workouts at LT1. And then to find max heart rate, well, that was pretty simple. I essentially just looked at all of my races and saw the highest my heart rate was getting up to in the past few years. And that served as a pretty good estimate for my max heart rate. It's probably hard to ever get to your true max. Your body tends to have a few beats in reserve, but that works well enough. And that's 183 BPM. It's the highest my heart rate has been to in the last few years. Heart rate max will come down gradually as you get older, so it's probably good to update that. And from that figure, I could get my 70% heart rate max, which serves as my easy run heart rate, and that's at 129 BPM. So by now you can see that I have a pretty good heart rate profile. I know my max, I know my LT2, my LT1, and also my 70% heart rate max. Now they don't have to be perfect or exact, but if I know that each run fits nicely into a category, well then it becomes much easier to calculate load. So for me personally, someone who trains sub-maximally all the time, I'm never going all out in training, only in races. It's really important to have clear parameters, to know exactly where I should be. I'm not just going off feels or perceived effort. So why I think it's important to have really clearly defined training zones or intensities, it's because it prevents you from just getting carried away on a particular run or letting things get out of hand. I can give instances from the past where, because I was basing things on pace, I didn't really account for the difficulty of a particular run because the pace was quite low. But if I actually have a look at heart rate, it's a really, really hard stress. There's one particular run that I used in the thumbnail last week. It was a long run. It was supposed to be maybe at a steady kind of effort, at least in the last part. And my heart rate got up to 185 BPM. Now that's higher than what my max is now. This was 4 years ago. So my max would have been, maybe it was about 185. So I was getting to max heart rate at the end of what was supposed to just be a moderate effort long run. Because it was 5:15 a kilometre pace, I didn't take any notice of it. I thought, yeah, it felt hard, but the pace says it's a moderate effort, so therefore it's a moderate effort. And if you watched last week's video, you know that I dug myself a hole in this particular marathon block, and it's because of things like this. It's because I wasn't paying attention to the actual physiological markers. I was just doing things based on an external marker, such as pace. But again, your body doesn't care about pace. Your body cares about the actual stress. And that stress was really high, and I would have known that if I was paying attention to heart rate. So now when I do those long steady runs, I'm paying close attention to heart rate to make sure that I stay below LT1. I want to train my body to oxidize fats, not to tear through carbs, because that's not going to help me in a marathon. I'd effectively be training the wrong energy system. But without heart rate, I wouldn't have a clear idea of when I've crossed that threshold. Okay, so I've just come out to Wentworth Park, which is about a 15-minute drive from home, to do 25 Ks at around 90 to 95% of marathon pace. I've come out here because it's a 6-kilometre loop. It's a little bit undulating, so it kind of simulates the back end of Melbourne somewhat, and I'll be able to collect my bottles as I come past the car. It's a pretty awful day today. It's really, really windy, and it's a bit cold, but not too cold. It's kind of in between. I'm not sure whether I should go with a singlet, t-shirt or a long sleeve. It's one of those ones, but hopefully all goes well. Gonna go with the super shoes today. I just found last week, I mean, I could go with the Super Blast, but last week, just in the last 10K, the Super Blast was a little bit sloppy, so I need something that's a little bit stiffer today. Just a little pinch of a hill going up into the headwind, and my heart rate hit 155. The only time I went over LT1 in the entire run. Just lost concentration in the last 300 metres of a 25k run. No.
That's okay. How did it go apart from that?
Boring. Very boring, but the effort was pretty comfortable, so yeah, it's good. Just the wind irritating. There's one point on the last lap where I was going up into the headwind, and I'd just taken on the drink, so I was quite bloated, and it was just like a hurricane force wind where I looked down at my heart rate was at 154, so right as high as I wanted to go, and I was running 4:48 pace, so yeah, it was nice having it on the way back. Yeah, right. So I averaged 402 a kilometre, an hour 40:58 for 25.02 kilometres. So yeah, perfect. That's exactly what I wanted to do. So where does this run fall on that heart rate profile graphic? Well, I averaged 145 BPM on this run, with a peak of 155. However, in the entire 101 minute duration of the run, I probably only spent 3 minutes at most above 150, and that was just when I was going uphill into the teeth of the wind. But in any case, you can see that the heart rate data places it just below my estimate for LT1, at the top end of the steady range. And to compare it with data from my most recent marathon, I averaged 158 BPM in Ballarat in 2024. But to compare apples with apples, I averaged 153 BPM through the first 25k in that race. Now, I believe I was a little conservative in Ballarat, and if it wasn't for the muscular breakdown in my quads, I potentially could have finished off a bit faster. So I posit that with better preparation, there's room to be slightly more aggressive in the early stages in Melbourne. So theoretically, my marathon heart rate through 25k should be around 155 BPM. Therefore, I have 10 BPM to play with, and I need to go roughly 25 seconds a kilometre faster to hit my goal time. With a taper, better weather, when I'm not gutter hopping and running on footpaths, and when I have a group to follow, that 10 BPM buffer starts to look fairly good. So in my mind, the data seems to suggest that everything is tracking well. I'll have a better idea when I run my first marathon-paced workout next Sunday, but all looks good for now. And this again just highlights how heart rate can be used to more effectively identify the right intensities, not only for training but for racing as well. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of marathon pacing. It's very common for people to go into a marathon effectively blind, other than the paces they've been able to hit in marathon-paced workouts. But it doesn't matter what pace you've hit in those workouts or what your perceived effort was. If your heart rate is nearing max, you just aren't going to be able to sustain that for 42 kilometres. Ultimately, perceived effort, or feel, falls down because it's impossible to be objective about our own running. We have a bias towards always wanting to be faster, and we're our own biggest cheerleader when it comes to spinning information in order to maintain that narrative. But when you have an objective number that's screaming out, you're going too fast, or this isn't the right intensity, it's a little harder to delude yourself. And isn't this what we want? To be more in touch with reality, so that we can avoid the disappointment of setting off too quickly at the start of races, or constantly battling injuries because we weren't able to stick to the right intensities in training. Anyway, that's enough for now. Until next week, remember, you can never take your hobby jogging too seriously.